Well, we're coming in for the video for the Battle of Lake Erie, which occurred here in my home state of Ohio, just off its shore in the Great Lake of Lake Erie in 1813. Now, this was a topic I wanted to do because I recently kind of discovered that certain people do not exactly either really know a lot about this or they don't even know it took place at all. And especially, like, for instance, if you live in Ohio or if you live in any of the Great Lakes states, it might be something you might want to know about. But for me, I've, of course, known about it because I got into history, and on top of that, I live in Ohio, so it was kind of bound to come up when I researched history in my own state. Now, the Battle of Lake Erie was a pivotal naval battle during the War of 1812 between the British Royal Navy and the United States American Navy here. And it was really the first major engagement. Well, not first really major engagement, but it was the first major American naval victory, really. The first real major one in any war. Because remember, this is the War of 1812. We're still a very fresh and very young nation compared to by the time of, say, World War I or the Spanish-American War. We've not even been a country for, I don't even think, 50 years yet. I don't think. So it's kind of the Navy, of course, the United States Navy is also still weak this time. And it also marks a very significant part because it marks the first time, really, that the British Royal Navy, which had been the best in the world for decades, actually suffered a defeat at the hands of not a major power, but a young fledgling nation. We were not a world power yet at this time. It was kind of significant on that end. And, of course, kind of changed the course of the War of 1812 in that theater. Now, it did not change the course of the war, but affected things in the theater that it took place. Now, to begin here, we are going to go look at some background to what ultimately led to this massive little naval battle. What's going to happen, of course, the War of 1812 is also known as the Second War of Independence for the United States. It began in June of 1812 when the United States again declared war on Great Britain for the first time since the American Revolution. They declared war due to a variety of issues, mostly arising from the British disregard of American neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars, in which Britain was still fighting at the time against the French Empire under Napoleon. So, of course, some certain things came out there. Now, the French were also just kind of disrespecting this, but the British were even more so. And truth be told, the British were actually starting to halt certain actions that were causing the Americans to get upset, such as impressment, which was basically boarding an American vessel, claiming that some of the seamen on these vessels were British sailors that had deserted, even though some of them were not. In fact, most of the time later on, they were not. And it was a way of Britain to just stop American vessels at will and just get sailors for their Royal Navy that they were pressed into service, even though some of them were not deserters. Not to say that some of them were, but there were a lot that were not. And this ticked the United States off a lot. Eventually, it kind of came to blows, but sadly enough, by the time the war was declared, they didn't know, because mail moved so slow those days, messages that Britain was actually bringing a halt to the practice. Unfortunately, it didn't get to Washington in time. So it starts in June of 1812. Now, remember, the United States is still growing at this time. It still has the territory that it gained after the American Revolution. It has all the way to the Mississippi River up to its eastern bank. They do not have Florida. Spain controls that. Oh, wait, no, I correct myself here. In 1803, they had purchased the Louisiana Territory, so we actually controlled beyond the Mississippi River. But we had a bunch of new territory for the United States and everything else. But of course, there were also the other problem that there had been Indian raids. As the Indians were gradually being pushed west by the settlers, many of them came to ally with the British during this war in the hopes that a British victory would lead to this stop of American encroachment on their lands. And these were commonly led by the great Shawnee chief Tecumseh, who tried to form his own little Indian confederation against the settlement of white people. And of course, he sided with the British willingly. Well, what we're going to bring to here is we're going to focus here on Lake Erie a lot. This is like the Great Lake I know the most because I live in the state that borders it the most. I live literally 2 counties away from that lake. So I'm very close to it. I've seen it. Well, anyway, Immediately, as soon as the War of 1812 breaks out, Great Britain immediately seizes control of Lake Erie and most of the other Great Lakes, except for Lake Huron, and that's not because the Americans have control of it, it's just so wide of an area. They just could not effectively hold control of it. But Lake Superior they had control of, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario were all seized, mostly due to one factor, and that was the fact that Britain already had warships on the Great Lakes. The Americans had very few. In fact, in Lake Erie, the U.S. Navy only had one brig. They had the brig called the Adams, and this brig was actually lost during 1812 by the end of the year when the British managed to take Detroit, which was more of a fort at the time, and of course the Americans launched a counterattack under General William Hall. Hall did fail, and the British commander, mostly because the British commander of that army that had taken Detroit, Isaac Brock, he used the British control of Lake Erie to really aid with his defense of the fort, and they also managed to capture the Adams during this failed attack. And the British actually took the Adams, converted it into their own, and they renamed it the HMS Detroit as a small sloop. And eventually, this ship was almost recaptured by the Americans in an assault near Fort Erie, which is in Ontario near the New York border, near Niagara Falls. And in order to stop the Americans from regaining this sloop, the old brig, the British had it burnt so that the Americans could not recapture the vessel. So that kind of ends that. But keep in mind here, they only managed to gain control because, unlike the United States, Britain already had naval forces on all the lakes. It was very easy to seize control of them. Well, you get the one problem that, because of this, you got a major problem that develops, and that's the fact if Britain controls the Great Lakes, it puts a vast amount of American territory under threat of both a land invasion and a naval invasion, mostly with the Indiana Territory and the rest of the unorganized territories in the Northwest, and the states of Ohio, the new state of Ohio, which had become a state in 1803, which is my home state. So anyone that lives in Ohio, go Buckeyes! Not the little sports team, but I refer to us all as Buckeyes just because that's a nickname for people from the state. So, I mean, you can take it as a sports team, but I take it as that. So, go Ohio. We'll go there. And it also would have led to a possible threat of Pennsylvania and western New York, who also border with Lake Erie and New York. In New York's case, it borders Lake Ontario. Well, the American Navy kind of saw this as a problem. They definitely saw this as a problem. And they started to agree after getting word from an advisor that came to them and told them of this problem that was done. This advisor also had been scouting out the lake, and he kind of told them a great spot to put a naval base on Lake Erie to maybe build these ships that they would need. And the spot that he came up with was Presque Isle. I don't know how exactly to pronounce it. And this is where modern-day Erie, Pennsylvania is. Now, this formed a natural little bay, but unfortunately, it also had a sandbar, so the entrance to get out was pretty narrow, but it also prevented ships from sailing into the bay and seizing control of it easily because the sandbar was only 5 foot under the water, and most ships would get stuck or grounded if they tried to get into the harbor/bay. And of course, this was chosen late in 1812 to be the main U.S. naval base to be formed on Lake Erie to try to counter the British threat. So this is what we're going to have here for the setup. Now, the Navy also puts in an order to have ships start being constructed. In particular, they want 2 new brigs being constructed there. That will be very critical to the Battle of Lake Erie when it comes here. And we're going to get the names of them here later. So we arrive at 1813. Now remember, the War of 1812 is called the War of 1812 because of the year it started, although it did technically last for 2 years in treaty terms. And then because it also, the slow news thing, the last battle of it actually was fought in early 1815 because they had not gotten the treaty yet. That told them, oh, war's over. But 1813, this is the year that we have the Battle of Lake Erie and a couple of other American successes. It was really the big year for the Americans, and then the next year was going to be the real bad one for the Americans. It'd be like the year of the British. But I don't know if we're going to touch on that really too much because it doesn't have to really do with Lake Erie. So anyway, in January of 1813, the Secretary of the Navy, William Jones, orders the construction of these two new brig corvettes, as what they call them. They order them at Presque Isle, Presque Isle or Presque Isle. I don't know how to say it here. I guess we'll just go with Presque. I don't know. And appointed Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry to command the U.S. naval forces in Lake Erie, or we can just say Commodore. Remember, there is not really too much of a distinction. The U.S. Navy is still pretty weak at this time. They really don't have even if they did have a bunch of ships, it would nowhere even rival what the British Royal Navy still had at this time. And they were very powerful. In fact, part of the reason the War of 1812 was bad for Americans was the factor that because of the Royal Navy's strength and the very weakness of the American Navy at the time, the British were fully able to implement a blockade of the American coastline. At around the same time that Perry is appointed the commander of the U.S. naval forces in Lake Erie, the British forces also receive a new commander for them, and this comes in the form of Robert Harriet Barclay. Now, Barclay had served in the British Royal Navy for years. He had actually fought in the Battle of Trafalgar. I don't remember how to pronounce that one either, but that was the main battle in Europe that kind of stopped Napoleon's hope of invading Britain with a seaborne invasion under Admiral Horatio Nelson, I think was his name. And Barclay had actually served in this with the British Royal Navy, and although the British had indeed won this battle, and this was in 1805, I think, the problem came with Barclay was wounded in that battle. He actually lost an arm. So we have a new British commander here on Lake Erie, and this commander happens to be walking around the decks, and he does not have an arm. He literally looks like a war veteran. Well, Barclay immediately is given command of the vessels of the Royal Navy in Lake Erie. He happily accepts this command. Now, Barclay immediately takes his squadron that he's given command of. In Lake Erie, the British had 6 ships, I think. Yeah, I think 6 ships it was. They had, let me think here, 2 brigs, 1 sloop of war, 2 sloops, and maybe 2 schooners. I know for certain there was 2 brigs. I'm not real good with old ship names, so that's kind of weird for me. But I know for certain there were 2 brigs. It was 6 ships in total that they had. And he takes these 6 ships and he starts patrolling the eastern end of Lake Erie to try to find any American vessels that may be out in the lake and sink them. But at the same time, he also begins monitoring the American naval base that's under construction at Presque Isle in Erie, Pennsylvania, determining whether he should make a strike or not, which ultimately he deems he should not with his current size of force. Well, Barclay starts getting pressure as this continues, and we're going to touch that here in a second. The Americans, unfortunately for the British, in early 1813, they managed to take control of Lake Ontario. So that's one Great Lake that is no longer in Britain's control. This is connected to Lake Erie, as we all know. And Barclay starts getting orders from higher up in the chain of command that you need to attack Presque Isle. You need to eliminate the American naval base in Lake Erie before they can mount a naval force in Lake Erie that can counter you and get rid of you, and then they'll have control of another lake. And Barclay starts arguing with his superiors, saying he needs reinforcements to even try to do so. Because not only is the sandbar problem a question, but he also knows that the Americans have been fortifying the area with thousands of men from the Pennsylvania militia, and he also knows that they are putting cannon guns in defense of the harbor, and he would definitely need a little bit of a larger force than he currently has for his invasion. So he starts saying, I'm not doing this without reinforcements, which were being constructed at the time in Ontario, Canada, in the province of Ontario at Amherstburg, which is in Ontario, Canada. I think it's near the point that it crosses over with Detroit, near the St. Clair River. I could be wrong on that. Barclay, instead of invading and destroying Presque Isle's naval base of the Americans, he instead places a blockade around the isle from July 20th to the 29th of 1813, but he cannot enter the harbor due to the factor of the natural occurring sandbar. And that kind of stops him from ever entering it, but he maintains a blockade for 9 days. Barclay eventually ends this on the 29th of July, because after he runs low on supplies, he deems that he needs to go back and refuel on supplies and everything else. But some claim it might have been because he was going to have a banquet held in his honor and he wanted to retreat for that. The cause is still kind of disputed as to why he ended his blockade. Perry had kept his ships in Presque Isle, and by this time his squadron is now complete. It's been constructed. They're ready with the 2 new brig corvettes of the Lawrence and the Niagara. Well, they go out into the lake immediately after Barclay leaves. After Barclay leaves with his blockade, he starts going back to Amherstburg. Perry and his men leave Presque Isle, and they sail to the port of Sandusky, Ohio, which is just north of where I am right now. So I've definitely seen that. And they go to Sandusky to pick up more supplies and to recruit more men for the ships that he has. And I think Perry had, I don't remember how many ships he had exactly. I think it might have been almost even with the British. But anyway, Perry subsequently, after going to Sandusky, he sets up a naval base on South Bass Island at Put-in Bay. And this is where he anchors his fleet. And effectively, although he's not out in force, he does go twice, though, to up north to Amherstburg to try to do a blockade. He eventually just keeps the fleet anchored at Put-in Bay, realizing that if the British want to go through Lake Erie to the eastern part of it, they will have to go by or near Put-in Bay, and anytime that they try to, Perry can just get his fleet underway, set sail, and intercept them before they can get away from the Lake Erie Islands. So effectively, although he's not having the physical blockade that Barclay had around Presque Isle, Perry is effectively blockading the British from getting any further into Lake Erie. They only have maybe any part of Lake Erie on the western end that was west of the Lake Erie Islands. And of course, this upsets the British High Command, and it also upsets Barclay because he cannot move in any action without engaging Perry's fleet. And now it's no longer bottled up. He had the best opportunity when he had it blockaded. He could have done something or just waited there longer, but unfortunately he didn't do that option. So that was kind of bad on his part. Now, what goes on here is the factor that after this becomes clear to Barclay that he cannot do anything, he cannot get further into Lake Erie without engaging the American fleet under Perry. He finally decides in late August that I will go out and we are going to have ourselves a battle with Perry's fleet, and hopefully we can get rid of it and hopefully gain control of Lake Erie again here. And this was really going to be the decider, because if the Americans failed to secure Lake Erie, then the British have every right that they can launch an invasion of Ohio down from Ontario, and this was a very real threat at the time. Well, Perry knows this, that the battle is soon going to be coming, because he gets word that Barclay has set sail out of Amherstburg and he's on his way to find Perry. And Perry understands this and he prepares his ships for the battle, but he also asks that a signal flag be sewn and created for his ships in order to signal the other ships in the fleet to engage the enemy when they got close. Now he tells his friend about this, and his friend, who by the name of Samuel Hambleton, he suggests that they put the dying words of their friend, who had died a couple months prior, Captain James Lawrence, and he had been killed earlier in the year during an engagement with the British on the lake, and they basically come up to the conclusion, well, why don't we use his dying words and put that on the flag? And Captain Lawrence's dying words had been, "Don't give up the ship." And Perry agrees, and they sew this onto a battle flag that is in a navy blue color, and then has white. It says, "Do not give up the ship," and they place this on the Lawrence, which is the flagship of the squadron. And then Perry simply, instead of going out and searching for Barclay, he waits for Barclay to come to him. He knows Barclay's out there searching for his squadron, and it's just a matter of time before he gets to Put-in-Bay. That sets up here the big preparations. Now I come to the battle that is going to ensue. This is the part that no one really knows, that we've had a battle in Lake Erie, but we have. There's been military battles. On the morning of September 10th, Perry's squadron anchored in Put-in-Bay. About 7 a.m. that morning, they spot Barclay's British squadron coming around Rattlesnake Island, which is an island another one of the Lake Erie Islands. Today it's privately owned, and it is located just northwest of Put-in-Bay. And this island is ironically named for two things, and that's A, it kind of looks like a rattlesnake a little bit, but it also back at the time had a large population of rattlesnakes. There actually used to be a lot of rattlesnakes here in Ohio, but unfortunately they've been the two species that we've had, both of them are now endangered and kind of restricted to the southern part of the state. There's no more in Lake Erie that we know of. Now, of course, because he now sees that Barclay's arrived, Perry immediately gets his fleet ready to set sail out of Put-in-Bay into an intercept and just follow the fleet. Now, of course, the wind is a little bit against them at first and more toward Barclay, but the wind actually shifts later on as the day goes on, and it gives Perry's squadron an advantage. Right here, both squadrons, both the British and American squadrons, kind of go out. They get ready to meet each other in line of battle formations, which basically puts the heaviest ships right in the center of a line. So we're going to show you here what a map is of what the area we're looking at here. This is a map of the Lake Erie Islands. Down here is Ohio. This is up here would be Port Clinton, somewhere on this peninsula. Right here is Kelley's Island. I'm sure we all know who this is if we live in Ohio. I mean, if you don't live in Ohio, I don't understand you know a whole lot of these places, but probably don't. But if you live in Ohio, you probably recognize most of these spots. These are the Lake Erie Islands. The largest island today, of course, this is a modern overlaid with a modern map. This is a modern map, and I've just simply drawn in the fleet things. This shows the modern border in Lake Erie between the United States and Canada. And the largest island in Lake Erie is actually Pele Island, but is on the Canadian side of the border up here. This is part of it. The largest island that the United States controls in Lake Erie is Kelley's Island. And of course, there's smaller islands in here. Well, this is Put-in-Bay. Put-in-Bay is located here on South Bass Island, and this over here is Rattlesnake Island. Barclay came in from down over here. He's coming from Amherstburg up in Ontario, Canada. He's coming down, and they see him when he rounds this point. This is when, in Put-in-Bay, they start seeing Barclay's fleet, and as Barclay's fleet continues to go out over here, Perry sets sail out of Put-in-Bay, and the battle occurs about right here. Just a little closer, that way we all can see it. Right here is where we're talking about, in Lake Erie. So the fleets do meet. Unfortunately, due to the wind and due to some misconcepted battle orders, the Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, rapidly starts gaining way ahead of the rest of his squadron. Now, this was kind of shook up because Perry had ordered that certain ships engage certain targets, especially, and he wanted his two brigs, the Niagara and the Lawrence, he wanted them to engage the two British brigs that they had, the Queen Charlotte and the HMS Detroit. In fact, they're all HMS. So we have the Queen Charlotte and the Detroit, which are the British ones, and he wants them destroyed. They're the biggest ships, and they're the most dangerous. Well, unfortunately, due to a mixed-up confusion with his sub-commander, let me see what his name is here, James Elliott, the gunboats and the schooners and the Niagara kind of fall behind, and the Niagara really should be up in the front, and it isn't. And there's been dispute between him and Perry in the years that came, and even to this day, there's still dispute over what exactly went on. But Elliott claimed that he thought that his target was the Queen Charlotte, where Perry claimed that he had given him strict orders that you are to help me attack the Detroit first, then we move on to the Charlotte. Well, because of this, he kind of ordered the Niagara to fall back, well, not fall back, but fall behind and stay out of range. So this kind of ended up being almost a move that almost cost them the battle. Although we do not know if he was guilty or not of actually doing this, we really don't know exactly where the confusion arose, but we just know it happened. Well, anyway, the Lawrence is rapidly gaining ahead of the fleet, and it's going straight for the British squadron. Well, this is where a disadvantage between British ships and American ships come into play in this instance, and that's the factor that all the ships in the British squadron were outfitted with long-range cannons. They could fire for a lot longer range than the Americans would. The Americans were all short range. They had to be closer to the ships to get an better accuracy and chance of actually hitting anything, where the British had a much longer range on their guns, and they could fire a lot earlier than the Americans could, because you only had to be so close for them compared to what the Americans had to get close to. So, of course, the first shot is fired at about 11... Let me look here. 11:45. The first shot is fired in 11:45 that morning. It is fired by the Detroit at the Lawrence as it comes up to it. And soon, almost every one of the British ships starts pounding the Lawrence as it gets closer, including the Queen Charlotte and a couple of the other ships that are in the British fleet. Well, the Lawrence, when it finally does get within range, it manages to fire a couple shots, but remember, it's right in the middle of the fray, and it's almost got no support. It's just getting pounded and battered into nothing, and the Lawrence eventually, after gets all its guns knocked out. It's basically just a flaming hulk of wood. And the other American ships are still behind. The British think they almost have this thing won, and Perry is actually on here at this point. He's at the brink of defeat. He's lost his flagship, and he might get captured. Well, he decides, we're going to surrender the ship, but I'm going to transfer my flag to another ship, which of course would naturally be the Niagara, which is your other brig. So he actually sets off in a small rowboat with his men, with 7 other men, including his personal African-American servants. What was his name here? Let me look. Cyrus Tiffany, and several of the other surviving crew members. They set off. They get off the Lawrence. They actually take the battle flag that says "Don't surrender the ship" with them, and they row half a mile under heavy gunfire that's going on, and they row to the Niagara and go to the port side and get on board. Of course, as soon as Perry gets on the ship, he somewhat chastises Elliot, but he mostly kind of refrains from doing so, and he immediately takes command of the Niagara and has his battle flag hoisted. Now, remember that when they abandoned the Lawrence here, just to kind of put you in perspective, not only was every gun knocked out on the Lawrence, and was it just a sitting duck, but the Lawrence had 4/5 of its crew had either been killed at this point or wounded. So that ship was not going to be able to do anything. So by falling back to the Niagara, Perry actually not only saved himself, but he's actually saved the outcome of the battle by choosing to fall back to another ship. This is a painting here that was made in 1865. It is probably the most famous painting of the battle, even because no painting actually took place during it, because I'm pretty sure you're not going to be in a rowboat and have a paintbrush in hand when you're getting shot at by cannonballs. And this painting, to this day, a copy of this actually hangs. I don't know if it's a copy or the original. It hangs in the rotunda of the Ohio State Capitol building here in Ohio, down in our capital of Columbus. This hangs on the ceiling. This is the famous painting of the Battle of Lake Erie, of Perry getting in his rowboat and then leaving the Lawrence, which is right here. They get in the rowboat. You cannot see the flag, but they're going to row to Niagara, which is somewhere over here. And Perry is the one pointing and kind of somewhat standing up in the boat. And they're going to get in this rowboat, and they're rowing away. This is the Battle of Lake Erie, of Perry's very famous scene. Well, unfortunately, things start going bad for the British here very quickly. And that's not the factor that the American ships haven't even engaged yet. They have not even engaged the enemy, and what the problem becomes is that the two major brigs that the British had, the Detroit and the Queen Charlotte, they aren't really watching where they're going, and they collide into each other. Not a head-on collision, but enough that their rigging gets entangled and they're like stuck to each other. They cannot move. Perry immediately takes advantage of this little situation, and he orders the Niagara to to sail full ahead to those big British brigs and to blast them, and at the same time he orders his schooners to close their range, get closer to the ships, and get ready to support fire, basically. And as the two ships are just tangled, Perry goes next to them with the Niagara, and he broadsides on both sides of the Niagara, are just broadsiding the ship. They're raking the decks, just blowing stuff up, blowing men apart, everything. And keep in mind here, I want to add something. Back in this time, yes, it was cannonballs, and we think, well, how does a cannonball kill somebody? Well, most often, it wasn't exactly people were dying on the ship from the cannonball, because the odds of you actually getting hit by one were not as common as you might think. What the damage became that would kill the men on the ship was that these ships are wooden. They're made of wood. When these big old wrought iron steel cannonballs are blasting into your hull, what does wood do if it breaks? It splinters. You got massive shards of wood and splinters just flying everywhere. And this is what was hurting most of the men. And then in cases where you got a cannon shot, well, there goes metal shrapnel that's going everywhere. So it wasn't exactly the cannonballs killing the men, unless you had grape shot, which is like multiple little tiny cannonballs that were wrapped in a pocket. They were fired in it, just little piercing musket balls on the deck that could kill you in like nothing. And basically what this does is you were not killed directly from the cannonballs, you were killed from the splintering wood and the shrapnel that's just flying everywhere on the decks. That's what's killing the crew. And of course, we know that a ship that's got holes in it is probably getting water into it. Well, the ships get blasted to hulk, to just basically bulk. They're nothing but wrecked hulks. Now, the British do eventually get the Queen Charlotte and the Detroit untangled, but unfortunately, by the time they do, the Niagara has sustained such damage on them that they really can't do nothing, and both ships are surrendered at 3 p.m. This is the heart of the British squadron. This is basically over. Keep in mind that when they did this, when they raked the Detroit and the Queen Charlotte, the Detroit is the flagship of the British squadron. Barclay is on this ship. Barclay is severely wounded during this, and his first lieutenant is killed, and almost every officer is also killed on both ships. Most of the officers are killed, and basically what happens is Lieutenant Finnis, he takes command of the British squadron, but he ultimately sees this thing can go nowhere, and he's the one that ultimately gets that order to surrender. Well, that basically ends the big major thing here. Now, some of the smaller British ships, like some of the schooners and gunboats, they try to flee. 2 of them actually do. And, of course, they're kind of caught up to by the American vessels and overtaken pretty easily, and they fail to escape. Perry has captured the entire British squadron on Lake Erie. He secured the lake for the Americans. And it basically ends the battle here. He went from possibly going to lose here when he lost his flagship to he turned this around due to pure luck on the part the British collided and the fact that he transferred his command to the other brig, to the Niagara. Now, also keep in mind here, one last thing, that while the Niagara was firing, it was not doing so alone. It was also receiving support fire from several other of the American gunboats and schooners, such as the Caledonia, for instance. Was another schooner that was out there that was helping them. And basically, when the British finally surrender the squadron, Perry gets back on the hulk of the Lawrence. He gets back on the hulk of the Lawrence, even though it's not going to do nothing. On his flagship, he still has them surrender on his flagship. Even though it is not going to be able to do nothing, it's like a smoking hulk, he accepts the surrender on his flagship. So he takes the sword, or whatever they did, on the hulk of the Lawrence. So for this battle here in Lake Erie, it's not exactly the greatest naval battle. I mean, Battle of Midway in World War II was by far greater than this, and amid other things. But it was very interesting to think that we had a major battle here on Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes. Well, for the British casualties were the following: we had 41 British were killed, you had 94 wounded, and 306 survived. The Americans, we had about 27 killed outright. Two men also later died from wounds, so we bring that total up to 29, and 96 were wounded. The British had lost 6 ships. They lost an entire squadron. We had gained all that, and really, the Lawrence was the really only heavy casualties we suffered. Captain Barclay, he does survive this, and remember, mind you, he's already missing an arm. Captain Barclay loses a leg and part of his thigh, and his remaining one arm that he has is rendered motionless. He can't even use it. So he's basically about crippled for the rest of his life. Almost. And basically, he got pretty bad, but he still survives this. Now, the 3 battered ships, the Lawrence, the Detroit, and the Queen Charlotte, their hulks are used as hospital ships until they can get the wounded back to Erie, Pennsylvania. And this includes the British wounded, I think. And unfortunately, a strong gale or wind comes up on the 13th of September. Mind you, the battle took place on September 10th. And this damages and collapses the masts of the Detroit and the Queen Charlotte, and they're rendered even more damaged to the point that they're basically useless. The Lawrence ends up actually being repaired, and it is restored to service in 1814, the dark year. Now, immediately after he had won the battle, Perry sent a message to General William Henry Harrison, who some of you may know, some of you may not. He actually served as our 9th president for a month. He has the shortest term of any president because a month after he took the oath of office, he died of pneumonia. And basically here, he writes in this letter, he writes a little message telling him, I have won the battle, we have secured Lake Erie, but the very famous words that we all know is that Perry writes this in the message. He writes that we have met the enemy and they are ours. That is the statement that we all, if you learn about Perry, most people will quote him as saying. Perry and his ships, they helped shortly after take Amherstburg, that British base where Barclay had been stationed in Ontario. They help ferry troops up there to get there, and eventually the port/harbor/city, whatever you want to call it, Amherstburg, it surrenders on September 27th. This paves the way for the crucial American victory at the Battle of the Thames under General William Henry Harrison himself in Ontario, Canada, later, in about a month or so later, in which the Shawnee chief Tecumseh was actually killed, and it kind of ended the Indian Confederation that he had been trying to build. And at the same time, kind of ended the threat of invasion to Ohio, the Northwest Territory, Pennsylvania, and Western New York. It really ended the war much for that theater of the war in the West. Well, unfortunately, it didn't end the war overall. We still had a couple years ago. 1814, the British really amped it up because Napoleon had his first surrender that he quit for until he came back briefly in 1815 for 100 days. And they were able to put a lot more of their forces in North America. They ended up actually marching and just burning Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. And they then subsequently went trying to take Fort McHenry in Baltimore. They failed to. That's where we get the Star Spangled Banner from. And they kind of retreat there, but it was a dark year. And eventually the Treaty of Ghent, signed in December, on Christmas Eve of December 1814, kind of ends the war generally, although the Battle of New Orleans, was fought in January 1815 due to the fact they didn't know about the treaty, but the treaty basically restored everything to the prior lines of territory that each side had had prior to the war breaking out. Basically, it was, we didn't gain nothing, but we didn't lose nothing. But to the Americans, it really gave a sense of, we are a true nation here, and we finally secured our independence once and for all. And it has that in that way. We have not had open hostility with the British since that war. In fact, today we're probably one of our best allies that we have is Britain. It's kind of ironic. But the war kind of ends with the sense that Americans did achieve some things, because although we had the dark spots like burning of Washington, D.C., like the Battle of Lake Erie proved that the U.S. Navy was starting to become a force that, if organized enough, could become a force to be reckoned with, which we all know today it is. And, of course, it was a major blow to the British because for the first time in their history, they had suffered a major naval defeat at the hands of a smaller nation. And their navy had almost never been defeated prior to this. Now, as for what happens here further afterward, what we're going to look at here, the Americans, they controlled Lake Erie for the rest of the war. And basically, it stops any threat of invasion to Ohio, Pennsylvania, and western New York. Perry was named captain following the victory, and he subsequently later served and continued to serve in the U.S. Navy after the war until eventually he died in Barbary in Trinidad in one of the Barbary Wars in 1819. He is actually buried in Rhode Island. I may get to go see his grave next year if I do what I'm wanting to do. So if I do what I'm wanting to do next year, I'll have to go to certain places, and I'll definitely have to make photos and put them on here and do videos on stuff I see. So let's see. Perry, basically, that's the end of his story. In 1820, both the Lawrence and the Niagara, which both ended up surviving the battle, even though the Lawrence was badly damaged, they were intentionally sunk near Misery Bay in Lake Erie, which is near Erie, Pennsylvania, for preservation. Back then, I don't know why, they thought that when you sunk a ship, you could preserve it, which in some ways you can if the water is in good condition. And in Misery Bay, it's actually not that bad. The Lake Erie currents in Misery Bay are so strong that they constantly bury things in sand. So if you're buried in sand, you got a pretty good chance you might be preserved for a while, even wood. And they had become kind of rotted and forgotten over the years after the war, and they basically decided, let's sink them for preservation in case we ever want them again. So they lay down there for years in that bay. Until 1875, they actually get the hull of the Lawrence, what's left of it, and they actually raise it in 1875 to display it in Philadelphia for the 1876 Centennial Exposition. Unfortunately, it later is actually lost because it is burnt and destroyed when a fire breaks out on its pavilion later in the year, and it destroys what's left of the Lawrence. The Niagara, which was still in Misery Bay, was raised and restored in 1913. It fell into disrepair soon after. They wanted more repairs done to it to try to correct this, but then the Great Depression came and World War II, and eventually it wasn't even until, I think, after about 1960 they were finally able to start getting going with those repairs. And it wasn't until 1988 they did a whole nother thing to it, and it really removed a lot of the original pieces of the Niagara, but still incorporated some pieces, so we can debate over what this ship is now, if it's either still the original Niagara or a replica, because of how much of it has been replaced by modern parts. But they actually create a new replica, or improved Niagara, I guess, and this is on display in Erie, Pennsylvania. It's usually docked there. Now, they do sail it out on Lake Erie at times, like in 2013, it actually was sailed to Put in Bay to take part in a reenactment for the bicentennial of the Battle of Lake Erie, which is quite impressive. If anyone got to see it, I didn't, but I got to see videos of it, and I fully intend that if they ever have another one here sometime in the future, I wouldn't mind going myself. And as for a memorial to the battle, in Put in Bay and on South Bass Island, there is a large 352-foot Doric column that was made that is known as the Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial, or Monument, whichever one you want to go with. And this was dedicated on June 2nd of 1936 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it serves as a memorial to the Battle of Lake Erie, to the American and British sailors who fought that battle and died, and it also serves as a memorial to the peace, the long-lasting peace and friendship that has existed between the United States, Britain, and Canada since the War of 1812. They have not fought ever since, and hopefully they don't. In fact, I really don't see them fighting any time in the future. That basically ends the Battle of Lake Erie and its prospects. A short little naval battle, and sure, not the most impressive thing, but for the factor, it's kind of cool to think that we had a naval battle take place on a lake, and not in an ocean, and it's kind of surprising to me that if you lived in Ohio, you don't know about it. Now, I do have some other photos here. So, this is the only photo I can find. This is the hull of the Lawrence in 1875 when they finally raised it, what was left of it, from Misery Bay. Remember, no cameras existed back in 1812, so we got pictures of the ships. It's just after they raised the hulks. This is what's left of the Lawrence. This was the ship that had gotten battered so badly, the one that Perry had abandoned. This was what was left of it in 1875 when they raised it out of the bay. Yeah, not much there, but it's still the basic. It's still the basics of it. And this was later burnt and lost, and we no longer have anything of the Lawrence. But this is what was left of it. Get a little closer and see any details if there is any. That was the Lawrence, 1875. Now, the Niagara was different. Niagara we still actually kind of have. The Niagara, this was what was left of the Niagara when they pulled it, when they raised it up from the bay of Old Misery Bay. This is what was left of the Niagara when they did this in 1913. Obviously, we got a lot more intact that had been preserved, and it's kind of impressive. This was 100 years after that, and of course, it sailed to Put-in-Bay after they restored it for the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Lake Erie. So it's been here for 200 years since. It took place in 2 reenactments, really. This is a picture in 1913 of the Niagara in Put-in-Bay after they had restored it, the ship. This was the ship that Perry had taken the rowboat to, and this was the one that ultimately kind of won the battle for him by blasting the 2 British brigs. This is probably the original because this is restored back then, now added with a bunch of modern features. So this is still mostly Niagara, so this is largely the very complete one. And today, it is still there. It's more considered a replica now due to how much has been replaced. But this is what we're looking at now with the Niagara, about when it took place with the bicentennial reenactment. This is what it looks like today. If you go to Erie, Pennsylvania, you can go see it for yourself. This is Niagara today. Remember, this is the ship that Perry transferred to. This was not the main flagship, but this was the ship he went to and made his secondary flagship after his initial one was bombarded to death. This is essentially the one that won the battle. And for a final photo here, we have the picture of the International Victory and Peace Memorial in Put-in-Bay. We can see the large, big old column they have here. The lake's over here somewhere. I know you really can't see too much of it, but I would like to go see this myself. You got the large column here, and then all at equal mass, you have the flags of the United States, Canada, and the UK, or Britain, all up there as a memorial to the long-lasting peace and to the battle that took place. So that is the Battle of Lake Erie, what exactly happened. So I know it wasn't exactly the most interesting, but at the same time, it's kind of amazing that we had a naval engagement on a lake, as I mentioned before. So I thought it needed to be mentioned due to the fact that not everyone knows about it. So that was that video. Now, I do not have any videos planned for next week as of this moment. So any suggestions that anyone may have are very free and open at this time if you have any. On Friday, of course, it will be VE Day, the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. Nazi Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945, and that will be a major historic day for this world, even with the coronavirus going around. And I will be posting a video on that day of how that surrender came about, and I will have in some form, we're going to have a symbolic gesture, not symbolic gesture, but a symbolic action to symbolize what we celebrate on that day, kinda, and what we remember on that day. So I'm still debating exactly how I want to play that out, but we will definitely do that. But we will definitely have a video that day. And again, if you meet a World War II veteran on Friday, give them thanks for what they did. They are the greatest generation. I think that's what they're called, our greatest generation, because they really took a stand for democracy during a time that it looked like it could almost be extinguished. And it really was a dark time for the world, and they stood up to the cause of freedom and fought for it, and ultimately came out on the end of triumph. So if you see any of them, I don't care if they served in Europe or the Pacific, definitely be sure to thank them for their service and their duty that they gave to ensure that we had a future. So that will be on Friday. Again, I don't have any for next week, so feel free to put something in the comments or put it in the discussion page on the main channel of any suggestions you may have for a video you may want me to do something on. Now, at some point, we will do a separate one on the War of 1812 in general, just because there's a lot more to the war other than the Battle of Lake Erie, and I will do that one day, but I will probably not do it for right now. Maybe in June, when it actually would have started, so we'll see then. But again, be sure to do any suggestions of anything that you may want me to do on, because again, I do this mostly not just because I want to do them, but because I hope to include the audience as much as I can. And if you have any topics that you may want answers to, I am more than happy to do the information that you wish, because the main purpose of this channel is simply to educate people on history and anything they may need help with on history. So again, feel free to do that. So I guess that really ends it here, wraps everything up. So basically, as usual, like, subscribe, anything like of that nature to the channel, to like the video, anything of that nature, and hopefully everyone has a continued good rest of their week, and hopefully we will all see you here Friday. But if we do not, definitely remember to give thanks on that day to anyone who fought in World War II. So basically, have a good night, and we will hopefully see you back on Friday.